I never expected that a simple box of cheap hair dye and a clumsy accident would completely change my life. But that's exactly what happened. For 28 years, I had moved through the world with a kind of quiet caution, building a life that was safe and predictable. It was a life lived behind screens, as a freelance graphic designer, and within the four beige walls of my apartment. It wasn't a bad life, not by any means, but it was solitary. And loneliness, I had learned, is a quiet hum that you can almost forget is there until something, or someone, makes you notice the silence. Let me explain. My world was a small one, centered on my second-floor apartment in a brick building that had seen better decades. My routine was my armor. Wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk, work. The highlight of my day was often the walk to the mailbox. It was a comfortable loop, a self-contained ecosystem of one. I had friends, of course, but they were mostly online or lived across town, our interactions scheduled and planned. There was little room for spontaneity, and even less for the kind of chaotic, heart-stopping connection I read about in books or saw in movies. Then Ethan moved into the apartment across the hall, 2B, and the quiet hum of my loneliness suddenly got a little louder. He was, for lack of a more sophisticated word, striking, tall and broad-shouldered, with a build that spoke of physical work, not time spent in a gym. He had kind, crinkling eyes and a slow, easy smile that he'd give me whenever we passed in the hallway. He worked in carpentry. I gathered from the sawdust that sometimes dusted his work boots left outside his door and the low thrum of a sander I'd occasionally hear on a Saturday afternoon. From my carefully curated distance, I observed him. He seemed to be everything I wasn't: confident, grounded, effortlessly social. I'd hear him laughing with friends on his balcony in the summer, the sound rich and genuine. I saw him help our elderly neighbor, Mr. Henderson from 1A, carry his groceries up the stairs without being asked. He was good. You could just tell. He was the kind of man you'd bring home to your parents, the kind of man who radiated a steady, reliable warmth. And in my mind, he was also the kind of man who was completely, unequivocally straight. So, I filed him away in the mental cabinet labeled unattainable. It was a crowded cabinet, to be fair. I'd nod and offer a small, tight smile in the hallway, my heart doing a stupid little flip every time he'd reply with a warm, "Hey, Alex." I memorized the sound of his keys in the lock, the heavy tread of his boots on the landing, the faint, clean scent of sawdust and soap that lingered in the air after he passed. He was a part of my routine now, a pleasant but painful daily reminder of the world outside my carefully constructed bubble. I wanted to know him, but the fear of what that might mean, of rejection, of making a fool of myself, was a wall I had no idea how to climb. So I stayed on my side, observing, and convinced myself that this was enough. It all changed on a dreary Tuesday. I was feeling restless, trapped by the gray sky and the monotony of a project that was dragging on. In a fit of what I can only describe as self-destructive optimism, I decided I needed a change. Not a big, life-altering change, just something small to shake the dust off. I decided to dye my hair. I'd always had plain, brown hair, the kind that never gets a second look. I bought a box of cheap, blue-black dye from the corner store, feeling a thrill of rebellion as the cashier scanned it. Back in my apartment, I felt a surge of nervous energy. This was something, at least. Something different. I draped an old towel over my shoulders, mixed the chemicals in the plastic bottle, and began the awkward process of slathering the cold, dark goo onto my head. It was messy, and I was clumsy, but I was committed. I was so focused on covering every strand that I didn't pay attention to my own footing on the slick bath mat. It happened in slow motion. My foot slipped, my arm flailed out to catch myself, and my shoulder slammed hard into the edge of the sink. A sharp, searing pain shot from my collarbone down to my fingertips. I crumpled to the floor, the plastic dye bottle skittering across the tiles, leaving a dark trail like a wounded squid. For a moment, I just lay there, breathing through the blinding pain. I tried to push myself up, but a fresh wave of agony in my right shoulder made me gasp. I had definitely done something terrible to it. And that's when the second wave of panic hit, one that had nothing to do with the physical pain. My hair was half covered in a rapidly setting, dark blue chemical paste. The instructions, which I could see lying on the floor, said to rinse thoroughly after 25 minutes. I looked at the clock. It had already been 10. I tried to lift my right arm again, to test it, but the movement was impossible. My left arm, while uninjured, wasn't going to be able to do the job alone, not with the angle of the shower head and the need to contort my body under it. I pictured myself calling an ambulance with splotchy, half-dyed hair. I imagined having to explain this to a doctor. The humiliation was a more potent pain than my throbbing shoulder. I was trapped, truly and utterly trapped by my own impulsive decision. I sat on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, my shoulders screaming, my scalp tingling, and felt a profound sense of despair. My safe, predictable world had been shattered by a box of hair dye. There was only one option. It was a terrifying, mortifying option, but it was the only one I had. I had to ask for help. And the only person close enough to ask was the handsome, kind, and presumably very straight carpenter from across the hall. Getting to my front door was an ordeal. I cradled my right arm against my chest, my head dripping a little, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Each beat was a word. Humiliating, stupid, ridiculous. I stood there for a full minute, my good hand hovering over the doorknob. What was I even going to say? Hi, you don't know me, but I've injured myself in a hair-dyeing incident and need you to wash my hair. It sounded like the opening line of a terrible, awkward play. But the tingling on my scalp was becoming a faint burn, and the fear of chemical burns or permanently patchy hair finally outweighed the fear of social death. I took a deep breath, opened my door, and shuffled across the small landing to apartment 2B. My knock was timid, barely a tap on the wood. I almost hoped he wasn't home. I could just deal with it, somehow. But then I heard footsteps, the sound clear and steady. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. And there he was, Ethan. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and worn jeans, a smudge of what looked like would stain on his cheek. He looked surprised to see me, his eyes widening slightly before settling into a look of concern. Alex? Hey, is everything okay? His voice was even warmer up close, a low, pleasant baritone. I couldn't meet his eyes. I stared at the collar of his shirt instead. My voice came out as a squeak. Hi. Yeah. No. Not really. I gestured vaguely at my head with my good hand. I had a bit of an accident, I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a mortifying rush. I was dyeing my hair, and I think I slipped, and I really hurt my shoulder, my right one, and I can't lift it. At all. And the dye, it needs to be rinsed out, like, right now, and I can't do it myself. And I know this is a completely insane thing to ask, but I trailed off, my face burning with shame. He didn't laugh. He didn't even look amused. His expression of concern just deepened. He leaned forward slightly, peering at my head, and then at the way I was holding my arm. Whoa, okay. Don't worry about it. Of course, I can help. Come on. He stepped back, holding the door open wider for me. Let's get that stuff out of your hair before it, I don't know, melts your scalp or something. He offered a small, reassuring smile. And for the first time, I felt a tiny flicker of relief cut through the thick fog of my panic. Maybe this wouldn't be the worst moment of my life after all. He led me into his apartment. It was the mirror image of mine, but it felt completely different. Where mine was sparse and sterile, his was warm and lived in. There were shelves he'd clearly built himself, filled with books and small, carved wooden figures. The air smelled of freshly sanded wood and brewing coffee. It smelled like a home. He guided me straight to his bathroom, which was clean but functional. Okay, he said, his tone shifting into a practical, problem-solving mode. Best way to do this is probably over the side of the tub. Can you kneel down? I nodded, my throat tight. I knelt on the bath mat, the porcelain of the tub cold against my forearms. I leaned my head forward, feeling incredibly exposed. My neck was bare, my eyes were squeezed shut, and the man I'd been secretly pining over for months was about to wash my hair. The absurdity of it was almost too much to handle. Just tell me if the water's too hot or too cold, he said, his voice close to my ear. I heard the faucet turn on, the sound of water splashing into the tub. His movements were efficient and sure. He tested the stream on his own wrist before directing the handheld shower nozzle toward my head. The warm water was a relief, washing over my scalp and soothing the slight chemical burn. His fingers were gentle as they worked their way into my hair. I had expected him to be clumsy or hesitant, but he was surprisingly deft. He massaged my scalp, his fingertips moving in firm, circular motions to work the thick dye out of the strands. He was thorough, taking his time to make sure every bit of the blue-black paste was gone. The rhythmic pressure of his hands and the sound of the running water were hypnotic. My panic began to recede, replaced by a strange, humming awareness of his proximity. "I did this once for my sister," he said, his voice a low rumble just above the sound of the water. "She tried to go platinum blonde from a box and ended up with bright orange, chemically fried hair. I was the emergency rinse-out crew then, too," he chuckled softly. "You got off easy with just a hurt shoulder." I managed a small laugh, the sound tight in my chest. "Doesn't feel easy right now." "I bet," he said, his tone softening with empathy. "Don't worry, we're almost there." This was the moment my perception of him began to shift. The confident, untouchable carpenter from across the hall was here, on his knees on his bathroom floor beside me, carefully rinsing my hair and talking about his sister. He wasn't just the handsome neighbor anymore. He was Ethan, a person with a family, with a history of helping people out of their self-inflicted hair disasters. He had a hidden gentleness that my distant observations had never picked up on. He turned off the water. "Okay, I think that's all of it. Now, for the conditioner that came in the box. It says to leave it on for a few minutes." He opened the little packet and squeezed the contents into his palm. The scent of cheap floral conditioner filled the small room. His hands returned to my hair, and this time, his touch was different. Slower. He worked the conditioner from the roots to the tips, his fingers sliding through the newly slick strands. As he worked, the pad of his thumb brushed against the sensitive skin of my nape, just below my hairline. It was almost certainly an accident, a simple consequence of the task at hand, but it sent a jolt through my entire body. It was a small, insignificant touch, but in the hyper-aware state I was in, it felt like a brand. My breath hitched. I was acutely aware of every point of contact, the pressure of his fingers on my scalp, the warmth of his body so close to mine, the way his knuckles occasionally grazed my ear. He must have felt me tense up. "You okay?" he asked, his hands stilling for a moment. "Yeah," I breathed out, hoping he couldn't hear the lie in my voice. "Fine. Just my shoulder." It was a weak excuse, but it was the only one I had. He accepted it without question. "Right. Sorry. Just a couple more minutes." He began to gently massage the conditioner into my scalp again, his movements deliberate and soothing. It felt less like a task now and more like a comfort. In that small, steamy bathroom, kneeling on the floor with my eyes closed, I felt a strange and overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for his help, but for his kindness. For a moment, I allowed myself to simply feel it, to exist in this strange pocket of intimacy without overthinking it. It was a brief truce in the war between my hope and my fear, and it was a truce I never wanted to end. After a few minutes that felt both fleeting and eternal, he rinsed the conditioner out, his touch just as careful as before. "All right, I think you're good to go," he said softly. He handed me a thick, clean towel, which I gratefully wrapped around my dripping head. I pushed myself up slowly, wincing as my shoulder protested. Ethan was already on his feet, holding out a hand to help me. I took it without thinking, his grip firm and warm around my good hand. He pulled me up effortlessly. "Thanks," I said, my voice thick. I finally dared to look at him properly. His face was only inches from mine. His eyes, a warm hazel I'd never been close enough to notice before, were looking at me with an unreadable expression. There was still concern there, but there was something else, too. Something deeper. The air between us was charged, thick with unspoken things. The sound of water dripping from my hair onto the floor seemed deafeningly loud. And then came the turning point. The moment that would replay in my mind 1,000 times over in the days to come. He didn't let go of my hand. Instead, his gaze dropped from my eyes to my mouth for a fraction of a second before returning to meet mine. I felt my stomach clench. He still held my hand, but his other hand, the one that wasn't damp from rinsing my hair, came up. I thought he was going to pat my good shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. But he didn't. His hand went to the back of my neck, his fingers gently cradling the space where my new, dark hair met my skin. My entire nervous system lit up. His thumb began to move in a slow, hypnotic circle, right on the spot it had brushed against before. It was the most deliberate, intentional touch I had ever felt. This was not an accident. This was not just a friendly gesture. His hand didn't stop at my scalp. It moved from my neck, his fingers tracing the tense line of my trapezius muscle, finding the knots of stress there. The touch was firm, knowing. It wasn't sexual, not exactly, but it was profoundly intimate. He was caring for me, soothing the ache that had nothing to do with my fall. His fingers kneaded the tight muscle of my uninjured shoulder, then moved across my upper back, his palm warm through my damp t-shirt. I stood there, frozen, barely breathing. My mind was a blank slate, all thought erased by the overwhelming sensation of his touch. He was still holding my gaze, his hazel eyes searching mine, as if asking a question without words. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know anything except the warmth of his hand on my back, the gentle pressure of his thumb on my neck, and the frantic, hopeful beating of my own heart. He was so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his chest. I could see the tiny flecks of gold in his eyes, the slight parting of his lips. The world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us in his small, quiet bathroom, the air thick with the scent of cheap conditioner and something else, something new and terrifying and wonderful. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, the fall both dreaded and desperately desired. The massage, if you could call it that, probably lasted less than a minute, but it stretched into an eternity. Every press of his fingers, every slow glide of his palm, was writing a new story on my skin. He was learning the landscape of my body, and I was learning that everything I thought I knew about him was wrong. The confident carpenter was also gentle. The untouchable neighbor was touching me with a tenderness that made my bones ache. Then, as slowly as it began, the moment ended. He let his hand drop from my back. He released my hand, though his fingers seemed to linger for a second too long. He took a small step back, breaking the spell. The space between us was suddenly a chasm again. He cleared his throat, and the sound was unnaturally loud in the silence. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes anymore, his gaze fixed on a point just over my shoulder. "You should probably get that shoulder looked at," he said, his voice a little rough. "An urgent care clinic, maybe. I can drive you if you want." "No," I said, the word coming out faster than I intended. "No, I'll be fine. I can call a cab. You've already done more than enough." I clutched the towel on my head like a shield. My mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. Was I crazy? Did I imagine the intensity of that moment? His sudden distance suggested I had. The shame I'd felt earlier came flooding back, but this time it was different. It was the shame of wanting something, of letting myself hope, only to have it snatched away. "Okay," he said, still not looking at me. "Well, if you're sure." "I'm sure," I said, my voice sounding more steady than I felt. "Thank you, Ethan. Seriously, you were a lifesaver." "Don't mention it," he mumbled, already moving toward his bathroom door, holding it open for me. The brief, intense connection was gone, replaced by an awkward, brittle politeness. I walked past him, careful not to brush against him, and made my way to his front door. He followed me, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. At the door, I paused. I had to say something more, but I didn't know what. "My hair looks darker," I said lamely, looking at my reflection in the small mirror by his door. He finally looked at me, a quick, fleeting glance. "It looks good," he said quietly, and then he opened the door. "Take care of that shoulder, Alex." "I will," I promised, and then I was back in the hallway, the neutral territory between our two worlds. I watched his door click shut, and I was alone again, but everything was different. The hum of loneliness was gone, replaced by a roaring cacophony of confusion, hope, and a deep, aching fear. I leaned against my own door for a moment, the damp towel on my head forgotten. My skin still tingled where he had touched me. I had crossed the hall to ask for a simple favor, and I had come back with a heart full of impossible questions. The next few days were a special kind of torment. My shoulder, diagnosed at an urgent care clinic as a severe sprain, was a constant, throbbing reminder of the whole event. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional gymnastics my brain was performing. I was trapped in an endless loop, replaying the scene in the bathroom over and over again. I dissected every single second of it. The way he looked at me when he first opened the door, the gentleness of his hands in my hair, the story about his sister. Was that just a story, or was it a way to put me at ease? And then, the touch. That was the crux of it all. The slow, deliberate massage. It couldn't have been accidental. It couldn't have been platonic. Could it? My mind became a courtroom. The prosecutor, a cynical, world-weary version of myself, presented a compelling case. He was just being nice, it would argue. You were hurt and vulnerable. He was offering comfort, the way you would to a spooked animal or a crying child. The intimacy you felt was a projection of your own loneliness and your pre-existing crush. He pulled away, didn't he? He got awkward and couldn't look you in the eye. That's not the behavior of a man who's interested. That's the behavior of a kind, straight man who suddenly realizes his friendly gesture might be misinterpreted and is trying to back away without causing a scene. But then my defense attorney, a hopelessly optimistic fool, would stand up to object. But the look in his eyes, it would insist. He looked at your mouth. And the touch wasn't just comforting. It was possessive. It was questioning. He was searching for a reaction. The awkwardness afterward wasn't from a fear of being misinterpreted. It was from his own shock at the intensity of the moment. He was just as surprised by the connection as you were. He's nervous. He doesn't know what to do next any more than you do. This internal debate was exhausting. I'd swing wildly from a state of soaring hope, where I imagined our next conversation, to a pit of despair, where I cringed at my own foolishness. I started avoiding the hallway. I'd press my ear to the door before leaving, listening for any sign of him. If I heard his keys or the creak of his door, I'd wait until the sound of his footsteps faded before I dared to venture out. We went from being friendly strangers to being two people actively avoiding each other, the shared space between our apartments now a minefield of unspoken tension. Once I wasn't fast enough. I opened my door to take out the trash, and his door opened at the exact same moment. We froze, like two deer caught in headlights. He was holding a gym bag, and I was holding a leaky trash bag. It was the most unromantic standoff in history. "Hey," he said, his voice tight. "Hey," I squeaked back. An awkward silence stretched for what felt like an hour. I could feel my face getting hot. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. I wanted to rewind time to a week ago when he was just the handsome neighbor and I was just the quiet guy across the hall. "Shoulder feeling any better?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward my arm, which was now in a sling. "Yeah, a bit. Thanks," I mumbled. "Well, this is leaking." I held up the trash bag as proof and practically fled down the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't look back to see if he was watching. The brief, stilted interaction was all the evidence my inner prosecutor needed. "See, he can barely speak to you. It's over. You made it weird." I spent that evening nursing my sprained shoulder and my bruised ego. I decided I had to let it go. It was a fluke, a moment of strange, stress-induced intimacy that meant nothing. He was a kind man who helped a neighbor. I was a lonely man who read too much into it. To protect myself from further humiliation, I had to rebuild the wall between us, brick by painful brick. I would be polite, distant, and I would never, ever let myself hope like that again. It was a sensible plan. It was a safe plan, and it made me feel hollowed out and miserable. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my computer monitor. The blue-black hair was a stark reminder of my impulsiveness. It was the color of a midnight sky, full of secrets and possibilities. It felt like a promise I had made to myself, a promise to be bolder, that I was now breaking. The next 2 days were quiet. I kept to my self-imposed exile, listening for his movements, timing my own exits and entrances to avoid him. The silence from across the hall was absolute. I told myself it was a relief. I was starting to believe it. I was settling back into my old routine, the familiar, quiet hum of loneliness returning like an old, unwelcome friend. The grand, chaotic feelings of the past week were fading, leaving behind a dull ache of disappointment. Then, on Friday evening, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't the tentative tap I had given his door. It was a firm, solid knock. 2 raps, decisive and sure. My heart leaped into my throat. I knew, with absolute certainty, who it was. My first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home. Just stay quiet, don't move, and he'll go away. My inner prosecutor was screaming at me to stay put. But then he knocked again. "Alex? It's Ethan. Can we talk for a second?" His voice, muffled through the wood of the door, sent a shiver down my spine. There was a nervousness in it that I hadn't heard before. The defense attorney in my head stood up and shouted, "This is it. You have to answer, for once." I decided to listen to the hopeful fool. I took a deep, shaky breath, slid the chain off, and opened the door. He stood there on my welcome mat, looking just as nervous as he sounded. He was worrying his lower lip with his teeth, and his hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He wasn't the confident, easygoing man from my observations. He was the flustered, uncertain man from the bathroom. "Hey," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My hand was gripping the edge of the door so tightly my knuckles were white. "Hey," he replied. "Sorry to bother you. This is going to sound crazy, but can I come in?" I was so surprised by the directness of the request that I just nodded and stepped back, holding the door open for him. He walked into my apartment, my sterile, beige world, and suddenly the whole room seemed to shrink, filled by his presence. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the living room, looking around as if he'd never seen a place like it. "Nice place," he said, though it was clearly a lie. My apartment was the opposite of his warm, handcrafted home. "It's a box," I said with a shrug, trying for a bit of levity. "But it's my box." He gave a small, nervous laugh. The silence descended again, thick and heavy with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't been said. I just stood there by the door, and he stood in the center of my room, two islands in a sea of tension. I knew I should offer him a seat, or a drink, or something, but my social skills had completely abandoned me. Finally, he broke the silence. He pulled a hand from his pocket and ran it through his hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a nervous tic. "Look, Alex," he started, his eyes finally meeting mine. "I've been a complete idiot this week." I blinked, surprised. "What?" "The way I've been acting," he clarified, taking a small step closer. "Avoiding you in the hall. That incredibly awkward thing with the trash. I'm sorry. I didn't know what to say." My heart started beating a little faster. This was not the conversation I had expected. "It's okay," I said quickly. "It was an awkward situation. I'm the one who should be sorry for, dragging you into my hair emergency." He shook his head, a decisive movement this time. "No, that's not what I'm talking about. It's not about the hair." He took another step, closing the distance between us until he was only a few feet away. His eyes were intense, searching mine. "It's about what happened in the bathroom. After." My breath caught in my throat. The courtroom in my mind went silent. Both the prosecutor and the defense attorney were holding their breath, waiting for the verdict. "I freaked out, Alex," he confessed, his voice low and earnest. "What I did, touching your neck, your back, that wasn't just me being friendly. I hope you know that. And when I realized what I was doing and how much I wanted to be doing it, it scared the hell out of me." Every word he said was a hammer, breaking down the wall of fear and doubt I had so carefully constructed. He was scared. He had felt it too. I've noticed you for a while," he continued, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "Since I moved in, really. I thought you were. Well, I thought you were beautiful. But I'm not. I'm not good at this. I've never done this before." He gestured vaguely between us. "This. And I didn't know if you were, interested, or if I was just completely misreading everything. So I just kept my distance. But then you knocked on my door, and you were hurt, and I just wanted to take care of you. And I guess I got carried away." The secret he was revealing was bigger than I could have imagined. It wasn't just that he was interested, it was that he was just as uncertain and vulnerable as I was. The confident carpenter was a facade, a role he played just as I played the role of the quiet, solitary designer. We were both just scared, hopeful men, standing on opposite sides of a hallway, waiting for a sign. "I'm interested," I said, the words rushing out of me before I could stop them. "Ethan, I'm very interested." The relief that washed over me was so profound it almost made my knees buckle. Saying it out loud, admitting it to him, felt like setting down a weight I had been carrying for months. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. It was the genuine, easy smile I had admired from afar, but seeing it directed at me, because of me, was something else entirely. It was like the sun coming out after a week of rain. "Yeah," he asked, his voice soft with wonder. "Yeah," I confirmed, a smile of my own finally breaking free. He closed the remaining distance between us in a single step. He didn't ask for permission this time. He didn't hesitate. His hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones with a tenderness that made my heart ache. His gaze dropped to my mouth, just as it had in the bathroom, but this time there was no question in his eyes. There was only intention. And then he kissed me. It wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was a kiss full of all the tension and longing of the past week, of the past months. It was firm and sure and searching, a confession and a celebration all at once. I melted into it, my good hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, rapid beat of his heart beneath my palm. It was real. This was happening. It was the furthest thing from a mistake. It was an answer, and it was the beginning of everything. In the weeks that followed, the world bloomed into color. The beige walls of my apartment didn't seem so drab anymore, not when Ethan was in it, filling the space with his warmth and his easy laughter. The awkwardness that had defined our interactions vanished, replaced by a comfortable, burgeoning intimacy. We went on dates. Real dates. We walked through the park, our hands clasped together. He took me to a tiny, family-owned Italian restaurant he loved, and I introduced him to my favorite quiet bookstore. He taught me things. He showed me the difference between oak and maple, letting me run my hands over the smooth, finished wood of a table he was building. I showed him how to use my design software, and he watched, fascinated, as I brought a client's idea to life on the screen. We were two different worlds colliding, but instead of chaos, we found a beautiful, unexpected harmony. My quiet, solitary life was no longer solitary. It was shared. The routine was still there, but it was now punctuated by the sound of his key in my lock at the end of the day, by shared meals and lazy mornings spent in bed. One evening, a couple of months after that first, world-altering kiss, he came home from work covered in a fine layer of sawdust. He was tired, but he was smiling. "I feel like I have sawdust in my soul," he joked, shaking his head and sending a small cloud into the air. "I can help with that," I said, a playful glint in my eye. I led him to my bathroom, a space that no longer held any trace of its former, traumatic memories. I had him lean over the tub, just as I had done, and with my own two hands, my shoulder now completely healed, I washed the sawdust from his hair. The role reversal was not lost on either of us. As I worked the shampoo into his thick, soft hair, my fingers massaging his scalp, I felt a wave of profound love and gratitude. The water, the steam, the quiet intimacy of the moment. It was all a beautiful echo of our beginning. But this time, there was no fear, no uncertainty. There was only the steady, comforting knowledge that we were exactly where we were supposed to be. When I finished, he straightened up and turned to face me, his hair dripping, his hazel eyes full of a deep, abiding affection that still made my heart skip a beat. He didn't say anything. He just leaned in and kissed me, a slow, grateful kiss that tasted of soap and love. I used to think that life was something you had to carefully manage, that love was a risk too great to take. I built walls to keep the world out, to keep my heart safe from the possibility of getting hurt. But Ethan, with his kind eyes and his gentle hands, didn't just help me rinse the dye from my hair that day. He helped me wash away the fear. He showed me that the greatest risks often lead to the greatest joys, and that vulnerability isn't a weakness, but a bridge to connection. Sometimes, the most unexpected moments, the ones born from clumsiness and desperation, are the ones that lead you home. And in his arms, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was finally home.